Was there ever anyone in your town or neighborhood that your mom and dad warned you to stay away from? For a lot of people my age, there's almost always someone they were warned about during their childhood. For some, it's a neighbor or a certain person in town, and in some more sinister cases, it's a teacher, maybe even an uncle. But for me and the rest of the kids in our small Yorkshire town, it was John Cutter. Cutter, as we used to call him, was said to live in this old farmer's cottage a few miles out of town. We'd see him around town every so often, but he'd never talk to anyone, and that was a fixture in our town. Everybody rabbiting on to everyone else. A 5-minute journey to the shops for a pint of milk might well take a half an hour depending on who you met along the way. For that reason alone, going anywhere with my mom was a huge pain. She'd stop and talk to almost everyone we walked past. But not Cutter. Never ever Cutter. For years I really didn't think anything of it. But what I do remember is going into town one day to buy a football with my mom. As we were walking back down the high street, I disobeyed my mom and started dribbling it back to the car. At some point I lost control of it, and it ended up rolling down the high street and stopping just outside a pub. I ran to collect it, and by that point it was sitting right at the feet of none other than John Cutter. Can I have my ball back, please? Cutter just stared at me, and then looked at the ball, then back at me, not saying a word. I remember thinking that he mustn't have heard me, so I asked him again. Immediately after, I feel my mom grab me by the arm and march me away. She drags me all the way back to the car park and starts telling me how I'm never, ever to talk to that man ever again. I didn't think I'd done anything wrong, but here Mom was telling me off worse than when I'd smashed the neighbor's window. The whole way home, I cried my bloody eyes out, but the message was loud and clear. Stay away from John Cutter. Then, around my teenage years, right when I was getting into that whole rebellious bugger off mom and dad phase, I ended up seeing where Cutter actually lived. It was an absolute mess, but that got me thinking that the reason no one liked Cutter was because he was just poor, a socially awkward and a bit scabby-looking fellow. I thought the same thing about the kid in the school other children used to bully, and I always felt just sorry for him. It wasn't his fault he had allergies and his nose was always runny and minging. And to me, the grown-ups in our town were doing exactly the same thing to Cutter. Not that I launched some campaign to change his image or anything. I just saw it as the oppressive conformist majority singling out and excluding someone who didn't live in the exact same way as them. Like I said, I didn't act on it. It just made me angry. So, in May of 1996, I'm 13 years old. I'm in my second year of secondary school, and it's almost the start of the summer holidays. I finished school on Friday afternoon, and as I'm making the short walk home, I notice there's an unusual amount of people and cars out on the streets at a time when it was normally just us school kids. So I've already got this sense that something isn't quite right as I hop the back gate of my house and walk round to the kitchen. Stepping inside, I'm greeted by the sight of my mom sat at our kitchen table. She's on the phone with someone, a box of Kleenex with a few used tissues around, and it's evident that she's been crying. I asked if she's all right. She hangs up the phone, then tells me something terrible has happened. Every year, once the weather turned nice, the local primary school would take its year sixes, that's 5th graders to you Americans, down to an old abbey not far from town. It's one of the oldest in the entire British Isles, so it's a huge tourist trap, and it's a big source of pride for the people around town. I'd taken part in the trip when I was that age too. Not most kids' idea of fun, but there were definitely worse school trips to go on. That Friday had been that year's year 6 turn to go down to the abbey. About 50 10 and 11-year-olds were bussed down there in the late morning, and one didn't come back. Her name was Jenny Campbell. She was 10 years old, and the entire town went into a frenzy trying to find her. That's why the streets were so busy. Word had gotten around fast, and people had just headed down to the abbey in their droves to help in the search. When the sun started going down, my dad and uncle ended up going down too with torches and whistles. I went to bed hoping poor Jenny would be found. at least so everything could go back to normal. But by the next morning, things only got worse. Overnight, a volunteer rescue worker had found Jenny's coat in some woodland not too far from the Abbey. Police were appealing for witnesses to come forward, scouring the area around the Abbey with dogs. It was like a blue and yellow circus had come to town, honestly. Police cars of all different sizes were driving through town all day, and a load of them were basically camped outside of Jenny's parents' house. But they didn't find her the next day, or the next, and after she'd been missing for a full week, I think people started to assume the worst. Less and less police seemed to be hanging around town, and people were definitely talking about it much less. Not so much because they weren't thinking about it, but because the idea of little Jenny not coming back was just too much to bear. I understood it was a really serious thing, but being the daft 13-year-old that I was, all I could give a toss about was the fact that I hadn't been allowed to play out for an entire week. Not long, I know, but to a kid that seems like forever. So when my mom and dad finally relaxed enough to let me play out with my mates, we had an absolute field way with it. What followed was basically Stand By Me, but if it was set in 90s Yorkshire, although I feel like I should assure you from the get-go that there were no close calls with train bridges and no one found any dead bodies. For obvious reasons, my mom had forbidden us from going down to the Abbey, but tell a teenage boy he can't go somewhere, that's just basically planting a seed right there. And as soon as one of my mates suggested that we go look for Jenny, that was all it took for us to march on the Abbey. For me, it was when a mate of mine said, "What if we find her, just at the last minute, and we save her from dying? We'd be heroes, boys. Heroes." And you know what? He was right. I couldn't understand why people hadn't found her yet, how the police could just appear to stop looking when a little girl went missing. So, off we went looking for Jenny Campbell, and for our sins, we found her. Right when we reached the forest near the Abbey, I tell the boys to hold their horses for a minute while I run off for a wee. After I'm done, I hear two people walking through the trees, only from the opposite direction my mates are. Two thoughts go through my head. One, what horrible prank have they got planned since they're sneaking up behind me, obviously, while I'm half done? And two, how in God's name have they managed to sneak around and approach from a totally different direction? I do my pants up and turn around, already in the middle of saying, "What kind of bloody woofdas are you, sneaking up on me while I'm having a..." But when I see who it is, I'm stunned into silence. It was Cutter, and he's holding the hand of a little girl who looked exactly like Jenny Campbell. John Cutter, the local pariah, the one people made nasty rumors about, he was about to be a hero. "Cutter, you found her." It was the first and last thing I ever said to him. Not quite loud enough to alert my mates apparently, but loud enough for him to hear. He hadn't actually seen me until I spoke, and when I did, he and Jenny stopped and turned to look at me. It was only then that I noticed how Jenny didn't seem very happy to be rescued. She looked exhausted, pale and terrified, with cuts and bruises all over her arms and legs. Maybe she was just too shaken up to feel celebratory just yet. If she'd been out there for a week on her own, there's no telling what she'd had to do to survive. Then, Cutter spoke in a low voice, addressing me by name. I have no idea how he knew what my name was, and I was stunned into silence for the rest of what he said, and I'm guessing you'll see why. It was a long time ago, so this might not be exactly what he said, but it's the gist of it. "You're Johnny, aren't you?" he said. I just nodded. "And you live on that cul-de-sac near Dodd's farm, don't you?" Again, I just nodded, noticing that he was holding Jenny's wrist a little bit too tight. "And your mom, she works in town, doesn't she? In that little charity shop, all alone in the daytime?" I just nodded. I didn't really know what he was getting at, but it was certainly having its intended effect. "You're going to tell everyone I found the girl," he told me. Because I did. Didn't I, Jenny? Jenny just flinched when Cutter said her name, and he had to repeat himself to get a response which amounted to nothing more than a whimper. Jenny's been lost, you see. Silly little thing wandered off on that school trip, and she'd been sleeping in the woods all on her own, all week. Isn't that right, Jenny?"
"Yeah,"
Jenny said, and the way her eyes fell made me think that wasn't quite the truth. "So if you're gonna say anything else, little lad, whose mom works all alone in that quiet little charity shop, if you're gonna go telling something different, that'd be a lie, wouldn't it? And if you were to go telling lies about me, that'd make me very, very angry." Cutter continued to just stare me out until I nodded my head and murmured in agreement. "Good boy. No excuses. This little girl had missed her mommy and daddy very much, and I think she'd like to see them." And with that, he walked off, leading Jenny by that unusually tight-looking grip. I wandered back to my mates, who promptly asked me what had taken so long. When I told them, I wasn't all that surprised that they didn't believe me, not first anyway. But when I gave them this attitude of, "You just wait and see, don't take my word for it," and they saw I wasn't lying. "So, Cutter found Jenny Campbell? Who'd have guessed?" one of my mates said. "I guess he's gonna be the hero now then, isn't he?" The three of them started going back and forth about how he deserved it after all. If he'd been the one to actually find her, that definitely deserved some credit, didn't it? It took me a minute or two to actually find the words to say it, like you have to understand how conflicted I was. Shut up and let him take the credit, and I'd get the biggest "I told you so" moment over my family. Speak up, and I'd be defending someone genuinely evil. But I had to. What other choice did I have? I had this strong sense of morality. I couldn't possibly back someone I thought was guilty of God knows what. "Guys," I remember saying, "I don't think Cutter found her." "Well, who did?" "I think..." There were a lot of words I could have used, a lot of ways I could have phrased it. I opted for the one that kept my delicate sensibilities intact. "I think Cutter took Jenny Campbell." I then had to explain to them exactly what he'd said to me, but with added emphasis on the way he said it. I might have been young, but I wasn't stupid. Something was wrong, but it wasn't like I was in a position to say anything. If he was psycho enough to take a little girl like that, he was psycho enough to hurt me or my mom to keep us quiet. But then again, if I didn't say anything, he might go on to hurt someone else. The census was clear. Go to the police as soon as possible, tell them everything, and then get whatever protection me and my family might require. But I'm ashamed to say that when I got home, I just completely bottled it. I'd have to start the whole thing off by admitting to Mom that I disobeyed her, and then I'd be following it up with accusing the bloke who rescued Jenny Campbell of being something I can't even say here. I got it into my head that it'd look like I was trying to make excuses for myself by making what was the worst accusation possible. It wasn't looking good for me, so I bottled it up inside. I just went upstairs, tried to take my mind off it, and failed miserably in the attempt. On top of that, I could barely sleep. I mean, could you if you were faced with that kind of dilemma? So that night, about 1 a.m, I sneak out of bed and grab a cigarette from my little stash of them under my bed. I open up my window and sit, actually quite dangerous now that I think about it, right on the edge so my room doesn't end up smelling of smoke. Needless to say, the nicotine didn't really help with the stress, but I was feeling moody and angsty, so it suited the aesthetic, I suppose. Then right as I'm smoking, someone walks underneath the streetlight just down the road. Someone who looked creepily familiar. But I'm thinking, it can't be him. It really can't be him. But it was. It was Cutter, and he walked right past our driveway and looked right up at me as he did. I was only leaning out the window for like 5 minutes tops, and I don't believe in coincidences, so I'd be willing to bet it wasn't the first time he'd walked by my house. I was so scared that I almost fell out of the window trying to clamber back inside before he saw me, but it was no use. He knew where I lived. I was relying on Jenny Campbell telling whatever truth there was to be told, but when word actually did get around that he was the hero that found her, I found it more and more difficult to speak up about what I'd seen, or rather, what I suspected had happened. They didn't exactly throw him a parade or anything, but there was a story about it in the local paper, and a mention on a regional nightly news channel. The hype came and went in about a week or two, and although Cutter didn't get any more social after the fact, people's attitudes around him definitely changed. Then that was it. For years, the story remained the same, and neither me nor Jenny had anything else to say about it. At least until Cutter died, and then it all came out. I could probably write a whole nother report about how the whole thing happened, but let's just say it was ugly. Really bloody ugly. A lot of shouting and screaming, a lot of tears, and a whole bunch of regret. A lot of people told me I should have done things that I'm not sure they'd have done, if they were in my position at least. That was probably the most frustrating part, trying to explain to my mom that I kept my mouth shut about it. For her. And I suppose that brings us to the moral of what happened to me, or rather mainly to Jenny, and to the whole reason I wrote this up in the first place. It's always better to tell the truth and face the consequences of something than to keep your mouth shut. My dad explained it like a bank account. You put the truth in a box and hide it away, only it will accrue interest for as long as it's hidden, until one day you let that truth out, and it's bigger and badder and more hurtful than it ever could have been otherwise. His way of explaining it summed things up perfectly, and if I could go back and do things different, I would. I'd be much braver and just tell the truth, so that we'd all feel that some semblance of justice was done.
I'm a 14-year-old female. This happened during English 2 weeks after the summer holidays ended. We were learning about Charles Dickens when some kids in my class pointed at some guy on a bike doing wheelies past the classroom, and he was looking into the room. Our teacher just told us to ignore him and carried on with the lesson. 5 minutes go by, and a girl in my class suddenly screamed and pointed out to the guy, who was now next to the window I was sat next to, but he quickly biked off. Our teacher pulled the blinds down and turned the lights on to carry on with the lesson. I had asked to take a time out outside next to the set of stairs that led up to the language rooms. When I sat down next to my girlfriend, I had heard a knock at the set of double doors on my left. I then hear a male voice who sounded around 16, asking to be let in, while also trying his luck at the door handles. Luckily, they were locked as always. I went back into my classroom, and my teacher informed me that our head teacher had called the police and that they were now on their way. We were starting to pack up for our next period when we then heard bangings at the windows, and I heard the same voice from the doors yelling some random words and cussing at us. The bell rang for next period, and the banging then stopped. Time skipped to when I'm in science in the middle of a practical, when my best friend then pointed out that there were police outside. Our chemistry teacher came over to have a look herself. So apparently the guy from before sped off after we made eye contact. I found it a bit creepy as I was on the other side of school, and then now that's where he magically appeared. I later found out from my girlfriend that the guy had been appearing on school grounds for the past 2 weeks, but nobody had mentioned anything about it. She also mentioned that apparently the police noticed he had a weapon on him. To this day, I still dread to think what would have happened if those doors were unlocked. This happened around December of 2019, at 7th period on my last day of the semester. Our school had a basement and led to other classes that kids would try to get into, because they were apparently really easy and had the best air conditioning. We had a test in that class and got done quickly, because I found it very easy. I decided to text my friend, who we'll call Cole, to get a pass and meet me in the bathrooms to have vapes. I asked the teacher for a pass and met up with him in the bathroom. Just before we got out our vapes, Cole's phone gets a text message. The message then said that we're on a lockdown. Cole and I wanted to see what it was like in the halls. We looked, and it was almost pitch black out there. The windows are only in the classrooms, but not in the hallways. We then thought that this must be serious. There was a man walking out there, and he didn't look like a worker or a janitor. We went into the bathroom, turned off the lights, and then hid in one of the corner stalls. The room was completely silent. We then heard the bathroom open and close. The noise of him walking went to the stall that we were in. Cole then said, "Dude, we have to crawl out from the stalls." The room was so silent that even Cole's whisper can be heard from across the room. The guy's breathing stopped, and we heard the stall being pressed in. I said, "Dude, go, go!" and then crawled through the stalls. The man was now full on banging the stall, as well as yelling. The door then opened as we were leaving, and the light filled the room, and I saw that the guy was in the hallway. We pounded on the door to Cole's class until they opened the door. Cole then explained everything as the teacher locked the door, also mentioning a gun sticking out of his pocket. I didn't see a gun on him, but I just went along with it. Usually middle and high school students would laugh for making a scene like this, but the kids in the corner were quite scared and concerned. There was a bang at the door, and a few of the girls would squeal from fear. Cole, the teacher, and I saw the man at the door trying the doorknob and banged out of frustration. He then walked away and down the stairs. We have probably been there for about an hour or two at this point. The teacher instructed us to go outside in a single file, where everyone would be greeted by cops. Cole and I tried to explain the guy's appearance to the cops and the deans. The cops patted us on the back and sent us home. After that incident, the school ramped up with security and added cameras. This never got any media attention, so we don't really know if the guy got caught or not. I'm absolutely convinced that guy's intention was nothing but to kill us.
When I was in 3rd grade, my history class took a field trip to an old mansion. I don't even remember exactly why we were there, but it was kind of in the city, and I think it was like 200 years old. We got inside, and we were given a tour first. When I say it was a mansion, I really mean it was a mansion. It had 2 floors, a basement and an attic, with about 10 bedrooms and 5 bathrooms. It also had lots of other rooms, like a library, several offices and living rooms, and a large kitchen. There was about 15 of us in the class, and after the tour, they let us look around on the main floor. They weren't watching us that closely, however, and I wanted to see the upstairs again, so I just walked up there by myself when no one was looking. Once I got upstairs, I noticed the smell that old buildings have oftentimes. I began looking at the bedrooms. I enjoyed history, and the house was actually very interesting to me. After looking at several bedrooms upstairs, I entered one on the end. I walked over to the window to see the view, but when I did, I heard a noise coming from the closet. I was a little confused and looked over at the closet. It was a really old closet, and I didn't know what would be making the noise, so I started to open it, but then I really got the creeps, and I decided to leave the room. I began to walk back out of the hall, and when I did, I heard footsteps coming from the room. I turned around, and what I saw was a man standing in the doorway of the room, staring at me. He was wearing a black shirt, gray pants, and just stood in the doorway and gave me a creepy smile. I turned and ran as fast as I could down the hall, downstairs, and back to the group. I don't know who that man was, but I really don't want to know. When I was a freshman in college, I had to take a geology class. For the class, we went on a field trip for extra credit. I'm not the best at science, so I figured I should go on the field trip to boost my grade a little. We went to a park that I guess had many different kinds of rock formations or something. It was an old park, and the professor gave us all a little checklist with a worksheet, and after briefing us for a few minutes, sent us out to complete the worksheets. There was about 20 of us in the class, and the park was pretty big, so we all spread out. I went with my friend John, and we decided to go far out to fill out the worksheet. We went up a hill and over some rocks and started working. We were actually able to complete it pretty quickly, as it was a pretty easy assignment. After we were done, we decided to explore a little. We walked for a few minutes and then came upon a large man that was walking down the trail. He approached us and told us that his friend had passed out and needed our help. He said his phone was dead and we needed to follow him quickly. Without hesitating, we followed the man. He started to run, and so did we. After about 2 or 3 minutes of jogging, we came upon a little wooded area. The man stopped and said his friend was behind a tree. We didn't see anybody, however. We looked around for a couple seconds, but then to my surprise, I saw several men come out from behind the trees in all directions. They were all rather large, and one of them was holding a stick in his hand. The original man we were with then told us to give them our wallets and phones. My friend John told him no. A man then came up to John and pushed him to the ground. I tried talking to them, saying to relax. They then all began to yell at us. We were surrounded, and finally, I decided to give in and took out my wallet and phone and handed him to one of the men. John did the same. They then told us to walk farther into the woods. I knew we had to try to run away. I whispered to John to run when we had a chance. We were still surrounded, so I pretended to trip over a rock and fall to the ground. When I did, I acted as if I hurt my leg really bad. They yelled at me to get up, but I said I couldn't, and they started to walk closer to look at me. At that point, the attention was taken off John, and he turned and ran, and I got up and ran between two of the men. It was pretty close, but I was able to escape. They all began running after us then. We ran as fast as we could. We ran, and we could hear the men behind us the entire time. Finally, we approached the hill we were originally at. We then started yelling, and the men had stopped chasing us. We got back to the group, but the men still had our phones and wallets. After reporting the incident, they were able to actually track my iPhone to an old house, and 2 of the men were caught. It was the scariest field trip memory of my life.